Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on LLMs, linguistics, neuroscience, and cognitive science. I'm sure some of you have been to the Simons Institute already. Let me just say a word about it. This is the I think undoubtedly the center, institute for theoretical computer science in the world, and it it was founded about almost 12, 13 years ago, as the name suggests, through a grant from the Simons Foundation, from Jim Simons. Now, in addition to the view of the Simons Institute is it promotes research in the foundations of theoretical computer science, but also from this viewpoint of the computational lens. So it's a very outward-looking institute, and that's very much in keeping with the program that we are running this year on large language models. So and it's particularly true about this workshop, which is, of course, looking out at beyond just LLMs and machine learning itself. And so the view of this workshop is that the starting point is that at a conceptual level, LLMs have. We think they have profoundly changed our landscape in terms of what language is, in terms of our understanding of brain and computation, in terms of our understanding even of what we mean by intelligence. And so these are questions, at these boundaries with these fields of linguistics and cognitive science and neuroscience, and so we think that there are deep interactions to be had with these fields, and maybe they're going to help us understand what the future might look like beyond LLMs. And so I should say that the workshop co-organizers, actually many of them are here. It's Jitendra Malik, Yejin Choi, Steve Piantadosi, and Surya Ganguly, so I'll pass the mic on to Jitendra, who will actually introduce the workshop.
Thank you, Umesh. So Umesh asked me to just say something about the whole context of the workshop, and I'll do this in a historical way as opposed to talking about the day per day of this meeting. I think we have to go back to like the 1940s and 1950s. The period after World War II was a very exciting period because the war had caused interdisciplinary groups to get together. So this was the time when the computer was created. But there was also excitement at looking at topics what would be the intersection of cognitive science, neuroscience, and computer science. So, for example, the McCulloch and Pitts paper, which proposed a mathematical model for a neuron, is 1943. In Britain, there was something called the Ratio Club, which was a bunch of people from different backgrounds, including people like Turing, of course. In the US, you had Shannon, who was developing information theory, but in fact, developed some of the key ideas for what's the current version of AI. I mean, there's a 1951 paper from Shannon on the entropy of English, where he tries to essentially consider this task of next word prediction. And he makes his wife simulate this model which can do next word prediction. And basically, it took us 70 years to figure out how to get a computer to be as good as Mrs. Shannon. Then we have this famous Dartmouth conference in 1956. But all of these ideas were being interacted with cognitive science, neuroscience. The foundations of neuroscience as opposed to behaviorism came from that era. And the foundation of, the coining of the term artificial intelligence, it came from that era. Now, over the years, there's always been this debate of, do the computer scientists have to take the insights from human intelligence seriously? And it's like a standard debate, so I don't want to repeat the arguments. And the fact is that we don't have to take it literally, but we have to take it seriously. Okay? And otherwise, we would not even be on this enterprise. It's too, the existence proof itself is value. And there are specific instances where it has had a big impact. So, for example, Hubel and Wiesel in the 1960s, around 1960, developed models of what happens in the visual cortex, and that essentially led to convolutional neural networks. Convolutional neural networks were first shown for some computer vision tasks, simple tasks like digit recognition, but when in 2012 it was shown by Hinton's group that they were combined with the access to GPUs and big data, that they could make really big advances on object recognition. That's what launched the deep learning revolution. So the deep learning revolution is 2012, which goes back to the success of convnets at scale. Convnets are derived from Hubel and Wiesel. So that's a very clear example. There are people in the field who've always been motivated by trying to understand the brain as well as develop theories of AI. Jeff Hinton is my favorite example because every time I meet him, every 5 years, he has a new theory of the brain. And he always says, and this is the way the brain works. Okay? But seriously, now we have the big advances of LLMs. And these call into question some of the beliefs that people have had. For example, Professor Noam Chomsky always argued about this poverty of the stimulus and so on and so forth. But at least in my own biased opinion, Chomsky has been proved wrong by the advances that LLMs and others have shown. Now, how does it apply across the board? Okay, I think there are some questions here. For example, I'm sure we'll hear in this meeting about the fact that LLMs are very inefficient in the use of data compared to human learners. Is that a problem? Is that a source of inspiration for AI? That's the kind of question we should ask. The trajectory of human intelligence developing often goes with sensory motor first and then language. In AI, it seems to be the other way around. Is that essential? Is that an artifact? Is that, will reversing it lead to better stuff? We don't know. So these are the kinds of topics for which we want to have a vigorous debate. And what we have tried to do is to bring in people from different backgrounds, in addition to the computer science, AI type people. And I hope it will be a fun week for everyone. Thank you. And to begin with, Steve Piantadosi is going to launch us.
Thank you. Awesome. So thank you, and thank you for the invitation to talk here. I'm really excited to talk about a lot of this work. And actually, it's nice to hear the introduction to the workshop, because the things I'll be talking about are very much at the intersection of linguistics and computer science, especially linguistics and computer science in the 1950s. So going back to kind of the origins of these things. In particular, I'll be talking about rules versus neurons, or kind of symbolic systems versus neural systems, and first going through a kind of case study of Chomsky-style linguistics, which is I think of as a kind of prototype of a certain kind of symbolic approach. Sorry. And then after that, looking at another focused example, actually examples from Chomsky in the 1950s of symbolic systems and what kind of modern neural networks do with them, and how we can make sense of kind of two types of systems, so rule-ish systems versus neural network systems. And the answer that I'll come to is actually kind of sort of an intermediate position, which is that while I think that many of the kind of Chomsky-style approaches were not good theories of linguistics, actually the idea of rules, I think, might survive. And some of the kind of core course ideas that people in that field have developed about language, I think, are still kind of fundamentally right. So I wanted to start off with what I think are just two kind of plainly true things about humans and brains. The first is that if you open up a brain, you'll get something that looks like this. Okay, so this is a drawing from Cajal of, I think, hippocampus neurons. And you can see that things are anatomically very complicated. I think it's a couple billion of these pictures you would need in order to capture all of the neurons in your brain. But importantly, if you open up a brain, you don't find symbols, right? You don't find ones and zeros. You don't find anything that's clearly interpretable in, say, computer science or even high-level cognitive science terms. What you find is sort of a mess, okay? And this mess is what motivated, this biological mess, as Jitendra was saying, is what motivated parallel and distributed processing approaches to cognitive science, right? People saying, let's start from some kind of assumptions about the architecture that look more biological and see what we can get from that. Can we come up with learning rules, and can we apply them to systems which are interesting, like language? On the other hand, if you look at people's behavior, what you see is very different than stuff like this. Okay, so here's a page from Riemann's manuscript. And you can see that it is kind of extraordinarily symbolic. So he's first of all writing in language. That's a symbolic system. When you write in language, you're writing in words, and words are made out of smaller symbols like letters or phonemes. And so you have sort of symbols on top of symbols. If you're Riemann, you're writing mathematics, right? That's a symbolic system that he's dealing with. And even more so, the mathematics that he's dealing with is mathematics of numbers, right? It's number theory. So he's thinking about kind of discrete, separable entities and making logical arguments about those. So dealing with symbolic systems in this sense is certainly something that people do. And the big mystery in the field, right, has been how to connect these two pictures, right? So how can you make sense of the fact that biologically we look like this thing, but behaviorally we look like that thing, right? We have kind of quite complicated and sophisticated symbolic systems that we're able to think with. Just to mention a little bit of history of symbols, symbolic approaches really trace to the early days of logic, at least. So Boole's book on Boolean logic, right, was called An Investigation into the Laws of Thought, right? So he was really trying to do cognitive science, trying to formalize some kind of notion of reasoning, and for that created a symbolic language that actually has antecedents in other people, like Leibniz was trying to do something like this. One point, people know the whole kind of history of symbolic AI, people like Shannon and Newell and Simon, Fodor and Polishin, programming systems like Prolog and Lisp. And I think of the kind of prototype or sort of main scientific claims as about human language as coming from Chomsky. So Chomsky worked out what's known as generative grammar, as well as some formalisms that really touched on the foundations of theoretical computer science. So in the 50s, Chomsky was interested in understanding things like what kinds of patterns and strings occur in natural languages, and what kinds of computational devices can model and capture those patterns and strings. So he was thinking about those in the context of understanding natural language. But nowadays, if you open up a theoretical computer science textbook, right, it'll tell you all about the Chomsky hierarchy and these kind of things, right? So think of Chomsky as really the sort of heyday of rule-based systems, and it's one that, unlike most of those other ones, has really persisted in the scientific literature, with people going to conferences about what kind of rule-based system is right, or what kinds of rules and principles are the correct ones for capturing human language. The general goal of Chomskyan linguistics is to find some small set of symbolic rules that characterize the grammatical sentences, not only in one language, but in all languages that we can find, right? So people often will work in one language, or like Chomsky, work primarily just in English. But the explicit goal is to sort of characterize human nature, right? Characterize the thing that is shared among all of the different languages that you see in the world. And so this had several hopes, right? One is that it would work for typologically diverse languages, right? Meaning ones that don't look on the surface anything like English, maybe nonetheless have some underlying patterns or structures or something which are shared with English. In doing this, you hopefully would elucidate some hidden structure and properties. I'll give you an example in a second of something which is kind of true in English and discovered in this framework, but corresponds to something which is non-obvious, or at least it's not entirely obvious how to get it from at least simple statistical models. And also make sense of acquisition, right? So have some kind of theory of how kids take the kind of input that they get and end up with a pretty abstract system of grammar, right, that can handle sentences and constructions that they've never seen before. And hopefully, in doing this, right, one of Chomsky's main claims was to find evidence for innateness, right, meaning structures which couldn't be learned based on the input that kids got, but adults nonetheless knew. And so if adults knew it, then it had to be innate. And so there should be, in principle, some kinds of biological connections there, right? Something about, the genetics of humans that enables us to learn language, and in particular learn certain language structures that you see in the world's languages. I want to give just a quick example. I was looking around a bit, trying to find kind of the simplest example of what I think of as kind of Chomsky linguistics style argument and reasoning. And I'll give you this example of what are called coordination structure islands. These were discovered by Haj Ross in the 1960s, and I think correspond to an interesting syntactic pattern. So here's a sentence. You can say, Miro bought a shirt. That's great. And you can ask a question like, what did Miro buy? Where the thing you're questioning is the thing in blue. Right? You're saying, what is it that Miro bought? He bought a shirt. OK. I could also say, Miro bought a shirt and car. OK, that's another fine English sentence. And I could question shirt and car together. Right? I could say, what did Miro buy? And you said he bought a shirt and car. The non-obvious fact is that if I try to question just car here, things go awry and sound really terrible. So I could say Miro bought a shirt and car, but then try to question just car, and I would end up with a sentence like, what did Miro buy a shirt and? Right? Which hopefully you kind of boggle at and think like, wow, that's kind of hard to understand. Okay, that not entirely sure. It doesn't sound like kind of grammatical English there. And so the observation here is that we're fine questioning some parts of sentences, like these nouns, a shirt or a shirt and car, a noun phrase. But if you try to question something inside of a noun phrase and leave the rest of the noun phrase there, like just question a car, you get something which is ungrammatical. Okay? This is not about meaning, right? So you can kind of think about this and come up with what the meaning might be, or you can kind of understand the intended meaning of him buying a shirt and what else, right? I could ask that the meaning in the same way. Or sorry, I could ask a question with that meaning in a different way, or I could substitute in nonsense words, right? And you would still get the same basic pattern. So the observation here is really some kind of peculiar and not totally obvious fact about syntax, right? And how the rules of grammar work.
Yeah. Suppose you try this on an LLM?
Yeah, so people have...
Somebody tried this?
Yeah, so there's a whole family of there's a whole family of islands. I don't know, there's 5 or 10 different types, which are syntactic constructions that you can't question out of. And as far as I know, LLMs do pretty good on them in general. And I don't know about contamination of training data and those kinds of things, but yeah, they seem to do well. I will say, though, that for many of the islands, that's what this citation here is, there's pretty good evidence, actually, that many of them are not syntactic, so that they have to do with some other kinds of pragmatic factors or something like that. But that's a whole debate. So I want to go through a couple kind of positives of this kind of tradition. One is discovery of these types of subtle properties of syntax, right? I think that fact is not obvious. And if you were thinking about just constructing a learning model, you wouldn't even know to look for it. Or you wouldn't even know to test an LLM on that construction unless you had discovered that as a kind of interesting quirk of how English happens to work and other languages. More generally, people who work in this tradition have found lots of forms of what's known as structure sensitivity. So here's another example of forming a question. The janitor who is married is meeting the man who is tired. Okay, if I want to form that into a question, like, is the janitor who is married meeting the man who is tired? The red is goes away, and a new is appears at the beginning of the sentence to form that thing into a question. And Chomsky and colleagues have made this point that, like, you know, if it's not totally obvious which is to get rid of, right? Like, which you might imagine getting rid of the first is or the last is or something else, and the right answer about which is to move actually has to do with some unobserved structure in the sentence, right? There's one kind of is which represents the main assertion, the like main claim of what's happening in the sentence, and that's the one that turns into a question, this one. So if you were thinking about a simple statistical learning model, you know, it might pick up on the fact that questions start with is, and maybe even ises disappear from the middle of sentences, but it's not totally obvious that kids get enough data to figure out in complicated constructions like this which one they should do. It's one kind of argument people have made. Can also see, you know, related to questions, you can see long-distance relationships in sentences. Here's just a conjugation one. So the horse that the man from Indiana was selling was. Here, horse and was agree. If it was horses, it would be were, right? And so this stuff in the middle, right, could in principle be anything. It could be very long and complicated. And so it's not the case that a simple, you know, short window or something is going to be OK for capturing grammaticality judgments in general. This is one thing that I think kind of attention heads have figured out, right, is how to have a bunch of garbage in the middle, but still have something about horse influence the probabilities of what's going to happen later on. And that's, I think, a non-obvious property of language that you know, comes from this type of tradition. There's also evidence that syntax, right, people have some level of syntactic knowledge that is separate from just the strings, right? So here's nonsense words. This is Lewis Carroll. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves. Did Geir Gimbal in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves and mome raths out grabe, right? So you can make a judgment about that being a kind of grammatical construction, even if you've never heard those words before, right? I think LLMs can do pretty well on that too, okay? This work also highlighted challenges of learning, especially statistical learning. So people, I'm sure, know Chomsky's example sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which he constructed to have pairs of words be basically zero probability in a corpus, right? So you never see things that are green are never called colorless, and ideas are never green, and ideas never sleep, and you never sleep furiously, okay? And so a naive statistical learner there would break down, right? If all you were doing was tracking kind of word-to-word transitional probabilities, for example, you wouldn't ever learn that. This work also encouraged cross-linguistic comparisons and documentation. So here's a purported universal of language. This is from Greenberg, not Chomsky, but you know, a lot of languages have if-then constructions, like if it's raining, then I'll bring my umbrella. And you never say that, I'll bring my umbrella if it's raining. So the syntactic, the if part comes first, cross-linguistically. And also found tight links to kind of logic and compositional semantics, right? So if we talk about like conditions under which a sentence is true, then there's a whole kind of calculus for converting sentences into those logical representations, which you know, I think is roughly right for function words, things like quantifiers, right? So if I said like, you know, every person is drinking tea, you understand the logical conditions under which every person is drinking tea is true. And I think it had better be the case that if an LLM understands the meaning of that sentence, it has to get the logical meaning, right? It doesn't matter how many people there are. There's an assertion about each and every one of them, and so on. We go through a couple negatives. Over the years, many people have pointed out lots of limitations of kind of Chomsky-style linguistics. One is that people in that tradition often didn't do experiments, so they had kind of insufficient data for claims or insufficient comparison between different theories. There's also been arguments that there actually are no universals, so that the things people have claimed to be universals, like the if-then construction I just said, either there's not enough data to conclude that, or there's always some obscure language that violates it, right? And if that's true, then it really undermines these claims about seeking to find human nature, right? It might be that there's no kind of shared, especially symbolic description of what's common in human nature across cultures and across languages. There's some bullying I'll talk about in a few minutes. There's people have argued about kind of that these theories are often only pseudo-formalized. So there's very few implementations of kind of Chomsky-style theories, which I think gives few checks on coherence, right? Like often when you implement something, you implement it and then you realize that the idea you had didn't actually make sense, right? You were assuming some kind of contradiction somewhere, or you hadn't fully thought through the conclusions of something. We can talk about this maybe in the context of LLMs, but many kind of Chomsky-style theories separate syntax from everything else. So they say things like, well, what words mean, or how you memorize chunks of words together, right? Idioms and those things. Those are somebody else's problem. Those aren't part of kind of real language. Those are like some non-linguistic thing that's happening. And I think that's actually been a huge mistake, or one of the key mistakes, because I think one of the things that makes LLMs work really well is that they do memorize, right? And they can learn chunks of things. And one kind of reasonable approximation of what they're doing is learning chunks of things and then learning to have little slots for variables and things so that they can generalize in appropriate ways. I won't go into the details. There's lots of terrible ideas about learning, lots of kind of claimed impossibility proofs of how you could never learn hierarchical syntax, or you could never learn things like these, the island constructions I was showing. Just oodles and oodles of kind of claimed proofs like that. In fact, the syntax textbook I had in undergrad kind of opened with a proof that it was impossible to learn syntax, but sort of a BS proof, not a real one. And so the result of this. Yeah, sorry.
So what goes wrong in the assumptions of the proof or whatnot?
Yeah, so that's a longer discussion, maybe. Often they're proved in kind of a gold setting, right? And there you're assuming things like kind of positive evidence only, which is probably not true for kids. Kids can say a sentence and see what the outcome is, and that breaks most of the kind of assumptions that people have had there. In a gold setting, you're also you're doing a worst case analysis, so you're assuming that the parents are maximally unhelpful. This is, of course, also not true in the real world. So it's sort of a valiant effort to try to formalize these things, which is what Gold was doing. But then the syntacticians just took it and ran, and assumed that it was true in the real world because it was true in these kind of toy models. So, okay, so the result of all of this, I thought I could summarize actually with one figure, and that's the argued sentence structure for the sentence, John likes Mary. Okay, and that's this. Okay, so this is a syntactic tree. John likes Mary is down at the bottom here. There's a little bit of good stuff, like likes is a verb. That's good, and likes Mary is a verb phrase or whatever. That's fine. But then you can see it's actually embedded in 9 or 10 levels of recursive embedding, meaning structure which is argued according to these theories to be present and to be there. Kind of the logic or the reasoning behind this is roughly that they're working in some framework where, if you want to form this into a question like who does John like, you make an argument like, well, the who has to go somewhere, and so each sentence has to come with a kind of slot for the who to go in. right? But who might be complicated, or you might question different things. You might say who likes who or whatever, right? You can think of complicated sentences which are related to this one. And so all of this machinery and stuff is there for forming those kinds of sentences, as well as for trying to maintain some kind of homogeneity across different syntactic structures, right? For saying things like, well, I don't know, a noun phrase and a verb phrase share some key parts of structure. That's been one kind of approach. And so, if a noun phrase has certain slots in it, or if a verb phrase does, then the other one has to. And so there's a whole family of, 50 years or something of arguments like this, which kind of justify each piece according to the assumptions of the theory. But if you sort of step back and look at this, right, you'd think like, okay, to say John saw Mary, you probably don't have to recurse 9 times, right, and create a bunch of structure and stuff that isn't actually there. I like this example in part because it was made by Margolis and Lawrence, who are 2 philosophers who work on cognitive science, and it's actually in a paper arguing that we should take this kind of thing more seriously. So it's not a straw man. Their paper is basically arguing like, look, generative syntax has discovered all this amazing structure, and people who are doing theorizing about cognitive science or neuroscience or whatever really need to take this much more seriously. I think it's bad news. Okay. And then LLMs. Okay, so you have to, from my point of view, at least working kind of at the edges of linguistics and cognitive science, right, this was kind of one very popular and fairly dogmatic approach, making strong claims about things like learnability and what's possible and not possible. And then LLMs come around. Okay, and LLMs basically break all of the assumptions, all of the principles of how people in that tradition argued you kind of had to work in order to discover things, as well as principles about how the kind of core mechanisms of, say, syntactic processing work. I think I was probably invited to give this talk because I wrote a combative paper in 2024, which got quite a few replies from linguists. So if you look up that paper on Chomsky, you'll see that there's, I don't know, half a dozen or a dozen people who wrote entire papers about what an idiot I am. So I encourage you to look at it. What I pointed to were some kind of key differences in how this system works. So one is that LLMs really embrace probability and information and prediction and data. And Chomsky, since the 50s, has argued that these things are totally irrelevant to grammar, right? His arguments come from thinking about sentences like the colorless green idea sentence, right, where, sure, word-to-word probabilities are not going to cut it for understanding that sentence. But nowadays, right, transformers or whatever, any kind of sophisticated machine learning probability model is doing much more than that, right? It's not just counting up word-to-word transitional probabilities. It's really trying to infer some interesting latent generative process, probably. As I said, LLMs seem to memorize, seem to have something like chunks of text with slots. And you can think about in natural language, there's lots of constructions like this, right? The more you X, the less you Y, right? And everybody just knows that as a thing. You can recognize that and parse it and understand it. If you were trying to work in the Chomskyan framework I just showed with John likes Mary, right, this would have some extremely complicated structure and would be re-derived anew each time you encountered it. I think what's much more likely is that we have pretty good and sophisticated memory systems for chunks of language, and we just know this as a chunk of stuff. And you might encounter enough constructions where X and Y are different to infer as a statistical learner that some class of things can appear as X and some other class of things can appear as Y. So one alternative to the Chomsky approach that's been popular and I think much more kind of in the spirit of LLMs is called construction grammar. And it's people who basically think of sentences as extensions of the lexicon, right? So I don't know, 20,000 or something different words depending on how you count, maybe 50,000. And so we clearly have a very capable memory system for remembering chunks and pieces of language. Maybe that same memory system is at play and working when we're doing actual syntax, right? That's essentially what construction grammar is arguing. One of the other key innovations, I think, is that LLMs handle lexical semantics, so the meaning of words, right? So there's some at least rough approximation to what every word in English means, right, encoded in, say, Word2Vec or your favorite transformer or whatever. And those lexical meanings have been traditionally ignored in much of linguistics, certainly in syntax, right, as saying, oh, well, that's like some other thing. We have to, somebody else's problem is to deal with lexical semantics. But I think by having a real version of lexical semantics, it kind of plays very nicely with this memorization, right? Because you can memorize things, you can give meanings like lexical meanings to chunks, and you can even learn some of the kind of lexical semantics of what goes in the different pieces of the different chunks that you're learning, right? So sometimes you might have a chunk that only cares about animates, right? Or that only cares about people, right? Or whatever. And all of those statistics are available to a smart statistical learner once you're not disregarding lexical semantics completely. In this sense, right, they integrate syntax and semantics. So many of these insights, I think, actually trace to work in cognitive science. I like to attribute many of them to Jeff Ellman. So he wrote this paper in 1992, called Finding Structure in Time, where he basically took a simple neural network and gave it sentences from an artificial grammar. And the artificial grammar had some regularities. So it had some syntactic regularities. It also had some semantic regularities. So certain words were paired with certain verbs preferentially and so on. And basically did what we now do with LLMs. So he trained this neural network to just predict the next word. And then looked internally at the states, what representations this thing found for the different words that it gets out. And here was Ellman's picture of this. So this is sorry, it's a little hard to read here. This is a dendrogram where things are joined. They're merged sooner if their representations are more close together. So for example, at the bottom here, we have sandwich bread and cookies. And those all have very similar internal representations in his neural network. Up here, we have things like boy, girl, woman. And then up here we have verbs. We have things like and chase, sleep, and move, and so on. Okay, so at the coarsest level, there's big differences between nouns and verbs. And then within the nouns, there's animate, kind of people-ish things versus inanimate things. And those regularities get picked up on just as a kind of consequence of prediction, which I think is a remarkable insight. Like, it didn't affect, say, linguistics and cognitive science in the way that I think it should have, right? We might have had transformers or something in 1994, right? But I think has these key insights, right? That you think about a system which configures itself to predict well, and if you're configuring yourself to predict well, then you will naturally pick up on the regularities which are present in the data, things like nouns versus verbs or different types of nouns. Okay, in case people are interested, I'll also point people to a recent paper my lab kind of collaboratively wrote called Why Concepts Are Probably Vectors, that kind of reviews the literature on concepts in cognition. So all kinds of debates about are concepts stored as prototypes or exemplars, or are there rule-based kind of definitions or semantic vectors or whatever, and more or less argues that this kind of picture, right, is essentially the right one. It's the same kind of picture you get in LLMs, where each word has a kind of abstract vector associated with it, and then that vector does something in each of the tasks you would use a concept for. So that vector matters if you do a categorization task, or if you do a generalization task, or if you try to provide a definition, right? That vector determines through a language model what the definition is, and so on. And so trying to argue that essentially this kind of Ellman view is right of concepts. They're kind of high-dimensional vectors which are configured to work well across all of the different tasks that we use concepts for. So one kind of interim conclusion here is that the success of LLMs at doing language is really hard to reconcile with many of the strong claims from mainstream generative syntax in particular, and kind of rule-based systems. It's not clear to me that there's any kind of rule-based system which does anything like what LLMs are capable of doing. What I'd like to talk about in the second half of this talk is kind of the opposite, okay? Which is there anything about symbolic approaches which could be right? Is there any reason for thinking that something symbolic might actually do a good job of describing what's going on with the kind of state structure that happens inside of an LLM or inside of a bunch of neurons, like the neuron picture that I showed you? And for this, I'd like to focus on one really simple example, which goes back to, again, Chomsky in the 50s, 1957, his example of A to the n, B to the n. So Chomsky argued that English basically follows this kind of pattern. So if I say, if it is raining, then you buy an umbrella. When I have an if here, I have to have a then. Okay, have to say if then. I can't just say if it is raining and be done with my sentence. Okay, and I can embed these things, right? So I can say, here's a double one. If it is raining, then you buy an umbrella. Then you'll own a lot of umbrellas. Okay, because each time it rains, you're going to buy one. And the point here is that you have two ifs, and you correspondingly have two thens. And you could, in principle, imagine doing more. It actually becomes hard to process 3. I think 2 is already a little bit hard, but very hard to process 3. And Chomsky and people argued that, let's not worry about that. Okay, maybe there's some symbolic system that truly lets you do however many you want, but you have just a finite working memory or something, and so you can't actually do it. Maybe you could do it with a pen and paper, or if you had brackets in a programming editor or something like that, you could do it. So the generalization, right, is that each if requires a then. And so if we think about kind of a subset of English, just ignoring the words in between here, we could have things like if then, and if then then, and if then and so on. Okay. People often don't write this with ifs and thens. They write it as this language, this set of strings, A to the n, B to the n, where for each A I have to have a corresponding B. And so Chomsky argued that in natural language you have structures like this. And why this is interesting or important is that you actually can't generate this language. You can't process it if you have a finite memory. So if you have a finite number of states, or if you're trying to do it with a finite state machine, the intuition is that to correctly generate these strings, you have to generate one B for every A. And so if I had a finite memory, I'd eventually generate so many A's that I couldn't keep track of them. Right? It would eventually override my memory bound. And so instead of that, Chomsky argued that there's something like a simple hierarchical grammar. Right? This is just some rewrite or replacement rules where I could have a sentence goes to AS. Sorry, that should be a lowercase b, or a sentence goes to AB. And if I follow these rewrite rules, I'll only generate strings A to the n, B to the n strings. Okay? This was, one of the kind of early arguments for there being sort of interesting forms of hierarchy in language, right? And one thing to note, which is relevant to the first half of the talk, is that it really requires you to not worry about the fact that your memory is limited, okay? Because if we really kept track of your non-limited memory, you'd only be able to do 2 or 3 ifs before you ran out. But if you're willing to kind of go along with that, then this might be evidence for some kind of hierarchical system as opposed to kind of a finite state kind of memory system. There's actually a couple of constructions in English that look like this. So either or is similar, right? So every time I have an either, I have to have an or. And so people sometimes think about these as kind of bracketing or parenthesis languages where I could have an either or inside of an if then. So I could have a open bracket, close bracket, and a different kind of open close. Or I could have an either or out here, and I generate sort of strings of valid parentheses like these called Deek languages. Critically, what you never see is something like this. Okay, so this would be if, either, then, or, right? Which is supposedly not part of what we find in language. Okay, so this kind of property, like the fact that you don't have these kinds of things, is consistent with this kind of grammar view, right? If you have a context-free grammar like this, you'll generate stuff that looks like correct parentheses, and you won't generate stuff that looks like incorrect parentheses like this guy. So in fact, Chomsky and colleagues in 2002 argued that this property of language, so this kind of ability to build up a discrete infinity, in particular of kind of properly nested structures like that, was the kind of key defining thing of human language. So supposedly all human languages had it, and no animal communication systems had it. Animals weren't supposed to be able to do it at all. They can think about this as recursion or discrete infinity, and it's supposed to be familiar to every language user, right? So it's just something which is one of the key discoveries of kind of pieces of human nature. What happened shortly after that is this anthropologist named Dan Everett was working with a group called the Piantadosi in Brazil, and argued that they don't have constructions like this. In particular, that they're not able to take like some piece of a sentence and embed it inside of another sentence. Okay, that's essentially what's happening here, right? You can take some chunk of stuff and embed it inside of some other chunk. And Everett said, no, in Piantadosi, you actually can't do that, that the sentences are just inherently much simpler. Just to give you an example of this, here's a sentence up top that you might say in English: the man that I saw is pretty. And that has like a little piece of a sentence inside of it, right? Because it has that I saw in it. And so there's a whole other subject and verb happening inside of the sentence that's picking out which man I'm talking about. So there's the main verb, is pretty, but then inside of the noun phrase, inside of the subject, I get another subject and verb together. Okay, and what Everett said is essentially that in Piantadosi you get things like the bottom, right? So it's not that these people can't express these thoughts or have sort of structured thoughts like this. It's just that the syntax of the language happens to break this kind of construction into two separate sentences that express the same idea. So I saw a man, he is pretty. It conveys the same idea, but doesn't have that kind of property of putting one chunk of a sentence inside of another chunk. I won't go into the details. I'll just refer people to this recent paper by Jeff Pullum that goes through this whole controversy, because essentially what happened is Chomsky and syntacticians kind of freaked out about this and managed to prevent Everett from going back to Brazil and continuing research there. Basically calling him a charlatan. Chomsky called him a charlatan in a Portuguese newspaper, and said, "Oh, that's not what we meant anyway." Right. So it's a kind of messy, ugly story, but a little bit interesting if you're interested in the sociology of these things and kind of what happens to people in big debates, maybe. Okay. So. All this is just to say that this kind of basic pattern, right, of taking chunks and putting chunks inside of other chunks in language is something that people have been very interested in. I'll just give you a couple of very brief examples. Tim Gentner and colleagues looked at birdsong, looking for these A to the N, B to the N kind of patterns, and if you could train them on small n, and whether they would generalize to large N, or train them on some tokens and generalize to others. Fitch and Hauser did the same thing for macaques, I think. I forget which primate that was. That was some primate. And there's actually a lot of literature, a lot of primate literature. This is much earlier work by Byrne and Byrne, looking for hierarchy in things like motor plans. So this, sorry, it's hard to read. This flowchart is a flowchart for how mountain gorillas will clean the stuff that they pick so that they can get the kind of inside of plants out. And there's a whole kind of procedure which they've argued is recursively structured in order to get them to do that. So there's this interesting debate about kind of chunking and recursion across animal literature. I'll just give one really brief example. I've worked some with Jessica Cantlin, who has a primate lab. This is a study by one of her students, Steve Ferrigno here, where we were interested in this question, specifically in the parenthesis languages. And so we'd show 4 different groups, so primates, kids, US adults, and then adults from an indigenous community in Bolivia that we work with. Often we can find adults with little to no formal schooling, and so you can get kind of a comparison of what formal schooling or reading and writing does to abilities like this, where all the groups saw a display like this and were shown, we're taught to produce training lists in this order. So if you saw this screen, you would hit open here, close there, close there. Okay, so we just learned to do that sequence over and over again. And then after you've reached a criterion on these two training lists, you're given the middle items, so these middle ones, and you're asked to produce them. Right? You've just shown them, and the key question is, what order do you click these things in? Right? And you can think of a couple of different theories. Right? In your training, you've gotten absolutely no evidence about the relative ordering of these parts. Right? So if you did a sort of strategy that just knew about the ordinal positions of the parts, you'd expect this order and this, where these are swapped equally often, right? Or where these are swapped equally often. On the other hand, if you were thinking about these as chunks appearing within chunks, then you should really like this pattern, and you should not like the kind of the improperly nested example of this. I can show you a monkey doing this if you're interested. Just a macaque doing this task. They get little treats when they get things right. So he's reaching down there and getting a reward. Some trials are like that, just kind of basic grouping trials.
Is there a version of this that we could think of in the context of action sequences? Because when I'm doing a bigger task, I'm always doing subtasks, and I often have to do the subtasks repeatedly.
Yeah, I think it's...
And that to me, as a vision and robotics person, that to me would be the ability to solve tasks which require hierarchical plans is the way this ability has to be there.
Yeah. We should talk about that, because I'd love to think of other kinds of tasks in this spirit. I think it's really understudied how you learn what the task is, right? It's not even clear how you represent kind of the task-relevant information or what you should be doing. But it's certainly one big difference between all of the human groups and the primates, is that the primates take 1,000 trials to learn what the task is, just to learn to repeat these training lists, right? And the humans take 10 or something, right? So we seem to be very good at kind of internalizing different internalizing tasks, which is one reason for this design. So it doesn't matter how long it takes you to learn the training list. The key is when I give you the transfer list, when I give you things you've never put together, do you put them together in a way which agrees with the kind of proper grouping or not? And the answer is yes. So here's kind of correctly nested or center embedded responses in green. Here's these crossed responses, right, which you would get if you were just tracking maybe ordinal positions of the parentheses and responding to match those. And then all groups will sometimes do this kind of response, right, which is like not wrong, but not great. Right? It's not kind of undiagnostic of what we're interested in. And so what you can see here is that the US adults, right, are way overwhelmingly center embedded. That's great. Remember, they've gotten no feedback about these particular items and how they should combine. Chobani adults, meaning adults with often much lower levels of formal education, are similar. Kids are also similar. And monkeys, when you first test them, right, they're about even between these two, right? So it looks like some maybe qualitative difference between monkeys and people. Something shared among all people is kind of properly nesting like this, and monkeys seem not to care. And so that's very much in the spirit of these claims about maybe hierarchy or nesting being a human, not only a human universal, but a distinctive feature of people. Story's a little bit more complicated, though, because if you give monkeys a few more training lists, then they're fine. So then they look like people. So here's on additional training data. Here's two of the monkeys, which now are majority center embedding. And then one monkey that's just off doing his own thing, always answering tail embedded, which is fine. Okay, so our kind of claim in this paper is kind of an intermediate claim, right? It's that in people there's a very strong bias for this kind of proper nesting, but in other species it's not impossible, right? It's just kind of dispreferred, right? It takes more data or more evidence to convince them to do that.
And have you run something like this in language models at any time?
Oh, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think we've done that. We have done it with all kinds, like you might worry about, these are parentheses and people know about these, and you can do them with arbitrary shapes and things, and yeah, we've run a lot of versions like that. Yeah.
Is there a hypothesis about maybe a need-based or need-driven structure of this thing? I mean, we talk about these Indians in Brazil. Maybe they don't need such complexity that perhaps an American or an educated person needs to sound maybe more, profound or more.
Yeah, I mean,
and all these things.
the people in Bolivia we work with look just like U.S. adults here, right? I mean, they're down a bit. But on most tasks, these kind of tasks are totally unfamiliar to them, right? So sometimes they're, it's hard for us to explain what the task is or what they should be doing or whatever. So I would take that as being basically the same as U.S. adults. I think the need-based question, is a good one, right? You might ask, like, why do any of these groups need to be able to do this, right? And I think that's a good question. Humans might need to be able to do it for natural language, right? Or, maybe it's just some feature of the architecture of our memory systems or something like that. Other than that, it's not obvious to me what the difference between humans and non-human primates would be. But, yeah. Yeah.
Seems to me there's some similarities between kind of this recursion and how number system evolved ancient, right? So initially you have 1, 2 kind of unary system, then you have decimals, which is more recursive. Right?
Yeah.
So is it like those aborigines, right, may have, if they run the evolution social complexity, they would eventually end up with a more recursive structure. Are their number system also like the kind of like ancient numbering system?
Yeah, so both their number system and English has separate words for up to 10 or 15, somewhere in that range, right? And that's pretty common across groups. But you're right that this kind of nesting structure is something you see. So, like, number is a very nice case of this kind of nesting structure, right? Where in English we would say like 4,842, and there's kind of identifiable little pieces there, and there's a specific rule for how those pieces combine and go together. I think that kind of morphological thing in counting is very common, but also probably essentially an innovation, right? It's there's lots of cultures that don't number words above, say, 5 or 10, right? And once you start doing that, you need some mechanism to deal with the discrete infinity, and this kind of chunking thing is one way probably. So yeah. Okay, so this is a couple human groups and non-human primates. Actually, after we published this paper, some people did it in crows, which is pretty cool. Okay, crows are like extremely smart and look a lot like kids. Okay, they only tested two crows, but both of them like this kind of correctly nested thing. There's also been some work looking at, just going back to the kind of A to the N, B to the N version of these, which is the simpler version, I think. There's been some work in LLMs looking at generalizations like that. Here's the 30-second ChatGPT version. Okay, so you can tell it something like, give me 10 unique sequences with the following pattern, increasing repetitions of A's followed by the same number of B's. Right, it's fine doing that. Can also ask it to match a specific pattern. So sorry, you can give it 2 examples here, doesn't quite do the right thing. 1 example, it also doesn't do the right thing. But if you give it 3 examples in this format, it'll generalize correctly to any numbers of A's and B's here. And so I'd like to think a little more carefully maybe about these patterns, and in particular the question of whether symbols are so wrong. Okay, does the fact that LLMs or whatever can do these formal language structures, does that mean that rule-based theories are no good or are totally not right? And I think that there's some suggestive work that you can actually combine the two of these things. So you can think about some connectionist models which operate over symbolic rules or learn to internalize things like grammars. And I won't go through the details of these, but some of these are kind of meta-learning experiments where you give them a couple grammars and they learn to be good grammar learners. Some of them are first one here is a compositionality learning system, so it has some symbolic system and some system for meanings, and it learns that kind of mapping, which you could also well describe as a rule. Or even some recent work arguing for kind of emergent number symbols, right? Where if you give a neural network, if you train a neural network in the right way, it will come up with what are essentially symbolic representations of numbers. And what I've been interested in maybe most recently is trying to think through the kind of underlying theory of this. Like in what situations can you think about a neural network or something as implementing or coming to embody or something, some set of symbolic rules? The answer might be never, right? It might be that they're just two fundamentally different kinds of things. But I think actually the answer is a little bit more interesting than that. And to get to the answer, some really old ideas I think are very helpful. So here's what I think of as kind of a key way of phrasing this question. Does the ability to generate A to the n, B to the n sequences, or whatever pattern you want, imply anything about the representation? Can you deductively know anything about representation from just the kind of behavioral pattern here? When I promised some old computer science, one of the things I was going to highlight, sorry, my images are too not high enough resolution here, is this paper by Edward Moore called Gedanken Experiments on Sequential Machines. And this was written in the 50s, where he was really interested in essentially circuit design and how could you measure the input and output behavior of a circuit and come to know something about its internal states. He's interested specifically in sequential circuits, which are circuits that have a little bit of memory or some amount of memory. So it's not like the inputs are always mapped to the same outputs. Sometimes it's the case that a sequence of inputs will give you some sequence of outputs. And in this paper, his kind of description of the setup is actually exactly what we face in cognitive science, right? It's one where there's an experimenter here, there's some machine or device or model or brain or whatever over here, and you can give it inputs and measure outputs, but then from that, you're trying to do something about the structure which is present inside of it, okay? And Moore, I think is virtually unknown in the field, but worked out a bunch of the, sorry? No, yeah, sorry, it's, yeah.
Bailey machines are...
Yeah, so it survives in digital logic stuff, but in cognitive science, not known.
Every student has learned this.
Yeah. And one of the important things that Moore, Moore, in this paper is really nice because it has a bunch of proofs about how long of an experiment you need to do as a function of the number of states the system has. Or can you present a long sequence of inputs and figure out exactly what the states are and how they're all related to each other? Under what conditions are you able to do that? One of the key ideas is basically this result, which is that for any behavioral pattern, meaning mapping of inputs to outputs, there's a unique minimal set of states and transitions that can generate it. People often, learn about this in the context of, minimizing a finite state machine or something like that. But here, I think it actually has a really important implication, which is that any device which has the input and output patterns has to, in some sense, realize the states and transitions which are present in the minimal machine, right? Because if it didn't do that, then it would be some other minimal form, right? So the the idea here, roughly, is to think abstractly about the states and transitions that are present in some system. And that system could be anything. It could be some grammars or LLMs or brains or whatever. In this A to the B to the n example, right, one intuition is that kind of what it means to be in a state is that that state determines your future behavior. Okay, that's what it means to have a representation or to represent some internal state. And that means that in this A to the n, B to the n case, each A to the n essentially has to be in a different state once you're done generating the A to the n's, right? Because what happens after each n, each A to the n, is you generate that number of b's, and that's different for each n, right? So there's basically no getting around this, and what you end up with is a kind of minimal version of minimal version of states and transitions that look something like this. So for each A, I get a B. If I get two A's, I get two B's, and so on all the way through. There's no getting around the fact that this set of states has to be present abstractly in the system, right? Because if it wasn't present abstractly in the system, then you wouldn't be able to generate the correct number of B's for each corresponding A. Okay. What's interesting, I think, in this context about rules versus neurons versus neural networks or whatever, is that these kinds of results are totally general, right? They have nothing to do with what the physical implementation looks like. And in fact, this structure of states is also what would be implied by something like a symbolic grammar generating these sequences, or in the ChatGPT example I just showed, right? There have to be at least this structure of states. There's a little bit of complexity when I say at least, which I'm happy to talk about later, but there might be more than this, right? So it might be that this state has 6 different realizations in the physical world depending on how you got to it. But the future behavior from any given state is always going to be the same. So you can always find a mapping from whatever the physical stuff is into a structure like this. This structure, note, is infinite, right? It's like a finite state machine, but it might have, it does have infinitely many states. If we're thinking about languages that have, where n can be any integer there. So the kind of interim conclusion here, right, is that patterns in behavior, like generating the right A to the n, B to the n sequences, actually deductively imply a certain set of abstract states and transitions. And this argument is general to how those states and transitions are implemented physically, meaning it applies to people and to LLMs and to symbolic systems and whatever. Okay, I think I have 4 more minutes, so I'll just go very briefly through one last part here, which is basically that Moore's paper was an early paper in this literature, and then there were lots of other papers building up the theory, right, of how you could find systems implementing different state structures and how you can relate pattern to behavior. And one that we've been particularly excited about is this book in the 60s, 1966, by Hartmanis and Stearns, called The Algebraic Structure Theory of Sequential Machines. This Hartmanis and Stearns you might know from kind of early computational complexity theory. So they won a Turing Award for foundations of complexity. Turns out before they did that, they worked together on this stuff, which was all about trying to understand the kind of abstractly how you could implement different state structures. And they basically came up with a whole system, an algebraic system here, of how you could do different implementations of states. And that is, I think, essentially what we need in neuroscience, or in cognitive science, or in kind of understanding these computational models. So if you know that abstractly, when you generate A to the n, B to the n, there has to be a certain state structure, it turns out that there's lots of different ways that that state structure could be realized. I think I'll just skip through this. I'll just say that, well, this is some work by a grad student in my lab, Karthikeya, where we've been thinking about the state structures that are implied for things like memory stacks. Okay, stacks are what you might use for implementing a context-free grammar or something like that. And part of what Hartmanis and Stearns worked out is that sometimes this is a finite, the state structure for a finite stack. Sometimes you can represent those stacks as other kinds of things, in this case, 2 things operating in parallel. And so here, if you push on the stack, you follow this transition. Here, if you push on the stack, you follow both of those transitions and go through. Okay, so you can think of kind of factoring the full set of states required for a stack into some components like this. Why we're interested in this is that if you crack open a brain, or if you open an LLM, you might know that it abstractly has to have states like this. But if you're just looking at part of it, you might find this, right? Because it might be implemented with some parallel system of kind of simpler states and transitions. And so Hermanus and Stearns worked out the whole kind of mathematics of what are all of the simpler systems you can combine together in order to express a given state structure. And in turn, you can think about that as what are all of the hypotheses for how I could implement a given abstract state structure. In some cases, even for the stack, you can find particular implementations of it that use a fewer number of states total, right? Which is a little bit surprising, I think. But it means that if you had a simple theory of nature, like nature, tried to have a small number of states, that you might not find kind of the most easy or obvious thing. You might find that it's realized and implemented in some other kind of complicated way. And if that's true, then that has real consequences for how we look inside of other systems like LLMs or brains and try to understand states and how they're related to each other. So just to wrap up here, the picture to have in mind is that there's some abstract states which really have to be present, right? They're from sort of minimal description of inputs to outputs. And so we kind of know what to look for. We should be looking for a mapping from whatever the physical stuff is, neural or computer or whatever, to these abstract states. And we might find only part of it, but there's this whole kind of literature for how to deal with part of it, right? You might find that it's only doing essentially a partial computation, which is one way to think about what these other components are doing, right? It's like the calculus of partial computations there. And the result, I think, is the hoped for result is some kind of principled science of implementation, right? Formalizing on the one hand what has to be there, that's the kind of more argument, and second, what might be there, right? Like how you might realize that thing that has to be there in terms of simpler subcomponents. In my lab, we've been thinking about this a lot in a number of different domains, so things like number, language, logic, different kinds of memory architectures. If people are interested, I can point you to this paper I wrote with Randy Galstell last year called Formalizing the Role of Behavior in Neuroscience, that essentially lays out some of these arguments trying to say, look, if you measure behavior, then you can sometimes come up with deductive arguments about what sort of has to be there in order to implement that behavior. If people are interested, I'm working on a bigger kind of book-length project on kind of formal foundations of cognitive science that are really just representing many of these earlier results, right? And saying like, oh, here's how you can integrate cognitive science with behavior, with implementation is using those ideas. So going back to LLMs, sometimes patterns in behavior necessitate some internal structures. And those internal structures might, in some cases, be isomorphic to traditional symbolic systems. I think that's what's happening in the A to the N, B to the N case. And that might be true because the symbolic systems, if you construct them right, might have the required state structure. And so I think what's still on the table, right, are essentially approximate forms of what has been argued for in many of these domains, things like grammar and hierarchy and logic. This is actually convergent with how a lot of people have thought about connectionism. So here's just a quote from Rumelhard and McClellan, that the macro or rule level can be viewed as emerging out of interactions of the microstrate of distributed models, although we may imagine that rule-based models of language acquisition may all be more or less valid approximate macrostructural descriptions. We believe that the actual algorithms cannot be precisely represented in the macro theory. So they're saying, like, look, the symbolic stuff might be a good description. It's just that the kind of implementation of that, it doesn't look like symbols, right? We don't look like Turing machines or whatever. Similarly, here's a quote from Smolensky. Symbolic grammatical theory provides a good approximation to the macrostructure of internal cognitive representations and functions. He proposes what he calls the gradient symbol processing hypothesis, which is essentially that, yeah, you have symbols, but the implementation just looks different. And you can see versions of this idea in other things like vector symbolic algebras, which are all about encoding interesting kinds of symbolic structures into vector spaces, as well as in linguistics, a recent paper basically arguing for a version of this, that we shouldn't throw out symbolic grammars altogether. They're probably pretty good approximations to some aspects of what's happening in language. So in conclusion, it's possible to have crummy symbolic theory, but that doesn't mean that all symbolic theories are crummy. In particular, every behavioral pattern necessitates some specific structure in latent states. Otherwise, those behaviors can't be produced. And I think the calculus of this has largely been forgotten in the field. Okay, but look out for a new book. And well-done symbolic accounts will propose some formal system whose state structure is minimal for the observed behavior. And if you do that, then those states are the ones that also have to be present in any physical implementation. And that's a whole longer argument that I'm happy to flesh out, but that's the gist of it. So thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak, and thank you to my co-authors on a bunch of this work.
You brought up these examples, which were Lewis Carroll example and the Chomsky example, which
Yeah.
very unlikely. So there was always a question of how do LLMs deal with it? And then beyond that, there was this thing that touched on very briefly about syntax versus semantics and how the semantics might be much more important, and that's what's being used in LLMs. So that was from that.
Yeah, I mean, those do look a little contradictory. Oh, sure, yeah. So the question was, I on the one hand talked about these examples where, the Jabberwocky example, for instance, where you could get a syntactic judgment without knowing any of the semantics. On the other hand, I also said that I thought semantics were important. So I think actually both of those are right. So I think that LLMs have figured out some version of syntax, right? Like they have some kind of abstraction over categories. But that abstraction over categories isn't enough, right? So it's not enough just to say that there's an abstract thing called a noun, and sentences have nouns and then verbs or whatever. That if you really want to model the probabilities in language, you really have to know something about the meanings, because those meanings do determine how likely different constructions or sentences are. But I think it's not super well understood exactly how those pieces fit together. But I think it is plausible. They're both very important. Yeah.
The short version of my question is, how big a deal are LLMs for the field of linguistics? The longer version of the question is, if you think forward, say, for the next 5 to 10 years, the field of linguistics, what are the 2 or 3 shifts, if any, in methodology, type of questions that'll be asked? What's going to happen?
Yeah. So the question is what's going to happen with LLMs and linguistics? And I have no idea. So I think it's important actually not to equate the kind of Chomsky style that I talked about with all of linguistics, because there's lots of people that have embraced probabilistic models, for instance, or lots of people working on construction grammar and versions of syntactic theories that don't do that thing with John Likes Mary. Okay, I think that the kind of integrative approaches to linguistics are going to be the thing, right? So. There's people that think LLMs tell you absolutely nothing. That's what Chomsky said. Literally, they tell you nothing about how language works. And I think that's really wrong. Like, I think that they certainly tell you something. They're imperfect, right, like any theory. But at the same time, they're really impressive. And they're way more impressive at capturing patterns in language than anything that we had before. So I couldn't predict what the future will be, but I'm sure it will include some good theories will bring in what we learn in machine learning.
Question here?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was super interesting. I was just wondering something about rule-based systems. So, like the Chomskyan grammars, my understanding is that they all rely on this like binary sense of grammaticality and like non-grammaticality. And so then the rule-based system gives you like certain constructions that are grammatical and some that are not. But my feeling is that like when you talk to non-linguists, like linguists like to make it binary, but if you just ask like a normal person, even some of the examples in your presentation, I'd imagine some of them are like, okay, it's a little off, but I can get what it means. And then conversely, things that the system predicts are grammatical, most people think that those are like more infelicitous or something. Is that a problem for rule-based systems in general, or like?
Yes. Yeah. So it's true that many people often talk about kind of binary versions. There's also been a lot of work in linguistics on non-binary versions. In fact, Chomsky in the 60s or 70s, right, had accounts that were the degree of ungrammaticality depended on kind of how many rule violations or something you do, right? And so people have been interested in modeling that. I think it ends up being very hard. Actually, I cited this paper by Fedorenko and Gibson on not having good empirical standards in linguistics. And that's one of the points that they made, which is that if you go and do the experiment, sometimes you find that things that are considered grammatical or ungrammatical in one paper are like above or below the threshold that they should have been in another paper. And so relating those is actually very hard, I think. And it's never been totally clear to me how intuitions about grammaticality, like you can ask people about syntax, but they often bring in all kinds of other things like pragmatics and semantics and things as well. So it's just a hard topic, I think, but important to pay attention to. Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. I'm curious how much the vision you laid out at the end is like aligned with the goals of like this new field, mechanistic interpretability. That sounded very similar.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that that's also very close to neuroscience, right? Yeah. So my main claim is that these tools from the 50s and 60s are really powerful for that, because they can chart out for you kind of what the possible implementations of different symbolic systems would look like.
Yeah. I had a question, which is it's to do with the notion of state.
Yeah.
Because we can think about state as discrete, right? But we can also think of state as continuous, right? Meaning some Rn. And in fact, going back to the 50s, you have this one tradition going off in digital logic, but there's this other tradition going off into control theory. And for control theory, state is Rn. And for you, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I've been stuck a little bit in the discrete world just because it's much easier to deal with, but there are people who use essentially the same tools. So this kind of more idea of a minimal description, and they've thought about it with continuous systems in neuroscience and cognition. So for instance, if you think about memory decay, right, that's like a continuous decaying function maybe, right? And you wouldn't want to model it with a discrete system like this. And actually, a lot of the kind of formalism that people develop still works in that setting. So you think about the state-to-state just abstractly as real valued numbers, and there being some update function between them. And that update function might just be a continuous function, and that's fine. The other way to think about it is that the discrete systems are kind of approximations, coarse versions of the continuous ones. And there's various settings in dynamical systems theory or whatever where you would think about that, where you think about conditions under which your discrete approximation is good enough for the continuous one for prediction or whatever task you want.
Yeah. One last question. I think we have a coffee break, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Last question.
Doesn't the finiteness of memory, in fact, be the root cause of a breakdown of this model? I mean, after even if you conceptually concatenate and combine all these these embeddings and things, at some point you're not making any sense because our attention is precisely the limit in some sense.
Yeah.
But even not only for a human, but even analytically, there is a limit, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge debate in the field. So one point of view is to say that, well, we might come up with a simpler kind of description or grammar by ignoring the finite memory limit. And the other point of view is to say, well, that's nonsense. Like, that's not a good description of people because they do have the finite memory limit. I tend to think of it, I don't know, I'm a little bit in between on this debate. I tend to think of it as, it seems surprising that there are cases where whatever grammar we have you could, in principle, imagine continuing to do it, right? And so it seems often valid to think about both, right? To think about what the infinite version is and the finite. Just like if you're programming, right? Like, I could learn Python, and what I learn and represent about Python probably has nothing to do with the memory limitations in the word and the text editor that I'm using, right? Like I probably have a abstract enough generalization or interpretation or something like that. But at the same time, you have to be real and admit that, like, okay, there's only 16 gigabytes or whatever of Python code that you could write there. So yeah, sorry, I don't have a great answer, but it's certainly one that people debate.
Okay, I think let's take a break here.
Okay, thanks.